Well, welcome everyone. Let's just take a minute to take a breath. Welcome the Holy Spirit to this meeting tonight to be with us. And we, in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit. Lord Jesus Christ, grant us the gift of understanding. Help us to understand the feelings of others, the desires of others, and the goals of others. At the same time, help us to understand ourselves in our actions and our reactions. Widen our vision beyond our own small worlds to embrace with knowledge and love the world of others. We welcome you to this meeting with us in our community, and we ask all these things in your holy name. Amen.
Thank you, Loretta. And with that, let me begin sharing my screen. And Loretta, I'm just going to ask you to please admit people as they come in. Can I have a thumbs up that you can see my screen? Okay, thank you very much. Thank you again to everyone who is here. Thank you to those people who have volunteered to be co-facilitators with me tonight. When we break out into smaller groups, they will be guiding you through the conversation. So before we begin today's experience, I want to be sure that everyone understands that what you are about to experience is not a game. This simulation is available to anyone to do, whether to facilitate or just to peruse through. But if you were to facilitate the simulation with anyone, always remember that this is not a game. These federal policies have literally affected millions of people's lives. So for those of you who may not be familiar with Bread for the World, we are a faith-based advocacy organization. We have been in existence for 45 years. We advocate at the federal level, and we have one sole mission, and that is to end hunger and poverty. But when we're talking about ending hunger and poverty, we're not talking about service programs. While these programs are very important, what we're talking about are what are the policies and programs that are in place that continue to keep people in hunger and poverty. And these are the things that we will be addressing today when we talk about ending hunger and poverty. So on the screen here is a depiction of the difference between equality and equity. Equality is when everyone has the same vehicle. In this case, it's a bicycle. But not everyone can ride the bicycle, obviously. Some people are too small, some people are too big, some people can't ride it at all. Equity means that you take that vehicle and you make changes to it so that everyone is actually comfortable on it, so that you have an equitable outcome. So as we go through this experience together tonight, I want you to think about the difference between equality and equity in the form of policies and programs. We're going to focus on two forms of racism in this simulation: institutional and structural. And we just will touch on internalized and interpersonal racism. So interpersonal or individual racism is that internal work. That is what we understand and how we're feeling and thinking around race, because we've all been socialized in this system where we have created this ranking for human beings. Interpersonal racism is how that makes itself known in our relationships and how we treat one another, especially people of color. Institutional and structural racism are those programs that are an integral part of the fabric of our society that creates the systemic barriers that you will see throughout this simulation today. I'm going to stop sharing for a second so that I can share a video with you. We used to do the simulation in person before COVID-19. And one of the things people said was that they just feel so bad. And we really felt like we needed to address that in some way. So I'm going to show you a video on historical trauma and what historical trauma has meant to different groups of people.
What matters in life is not what happens to you, but what you remember and how you remember it.
My dad said when they were growing up, they said, we used to play cowboys and Indians. And he started telling me this story. And we used to fight over, nobody wanted to be the Indian. And he said, I didn't think about that. We'd all play, and I'd always suck it up and I'd be the Indian. But how ironic is it for a bunch of Indian children to be playing cowboys and Indians and nobody wants to be the Indian? The introduction of a destruction of culture and loss of what is good. And I asked my dad, well, why didn't anybody want to be the Indian? And I thought I knew the answer. He said, because everybody knows the Indian dies. That already in his generation, as strong as he was, he received a message as a young child. I received the same message, that it was not good to be Indian.
Slavery, colonization, forced relocation, and other historically traumatic events in generations past have lingering and profound consequences today. But what is historical trauma?
Historical trauma has to do with collective, cumulative emotional wounding over and across generations that results from massive cataclysmic events. These are events that don't just target an individual, but they target a whole collective community. Things like forced relocation from traditional homelands, like the Trail of Tears, like my ancestors went through. But the process that our communities talk a lot about is that the trauma is held personally, and it can be transmitted over generations. So even family members who have not had a direct experience of the trauma itself can feel the effects of that event generations later.
Does historical trauma only affect certain groups of people?
What really helps me to help understand the notion of historical trauma is that it's actually a phenomenon that lots of communities, indigenous communities, or people all over the world have sort of struggled with. It's not something that specifically is only owned by tribal people or indigenous people. It gets articulated all over the world.
Historical trauma is widespread, affecting many communities across the globe.
Observation has, from the empirical side, started with work on the Holocaust survivors. And there's a lot of work on intergenerational transmission of trauma. And it's moved into also looking at Japanese internment survivors, Armenian survivors, descendants of their Holocaust, and so forth. So there's been some more empirical work in this area. And you can imagine trying to track trauma over generations and trying to tease out what is the impact over generations on this child, combined with whatever traumatic events they've gone through in their childhood and in their lifetime.
Historical trauma is passed on across generations.
I say to you, acknowledgement is due my grandfather Pop. He never told us the stories of why he did certain things. He never shared with us why he never cried, for example. He never shared with us why he walked out the door when my grandmother cried. Why he turned his back when she cried. Of course we thought he turned his back because he didn't care, of course. But he turned his back, as I look back now, because the pain has no words. I still have the images of him dealing with the limitations that he was up against. I can only imagine the pain. But what I do know is that it didn't go away. It came inside into those of us who followed him.
No one ever talks about the moment you found out that you were white, or the moment you found out that you were black. That's a profound revelation. The minute you find that out, something happens. You have to renegotiate everything, and that's a profound psychological moment.
I saw a water fountain that said white in color. My family was 7 kids by then. We drank a lot of Kool-Aid. So colored water, that was in my cognitive schema. So I go toward this colored water fountain. And while I'm there, just before I get there, there's a little white girl who saw that same colored water fountain, and she was just about to turn the sprocket when her mother came and grabbed her by the arm. And she said, you cannot drink from that colored water fountain. And she said, but I want the colored water. I want the colored water. Oh, I want the colored water. So I knew it must be good. So I run to the colored water fountain, looking for my mom, making sure she won't stop me from drinking. And I turned the water fountain, and it was clear, just like at home. That day, that trauma, I remember to this moment.
For African American communities, historical identity and understanding is inextricably tied to the reality of enslavement.
It ties us to enslavement with what an awful terror, 400 years of trauma we experienced. And for us, we talk about it as being utter cultural erasure.
You're telling me this story.
Okay, everybody's doing okay? Thumbs up. All right, let me start sharing my screen again. So feel free as we go through the simulation to please share your thoughts in the chat box. We've got facilitators that are going to monitor the chat box, or if you have any questions or comments, or if you just want to share with us why you're here today. What do you expect? What are you expecting from this experience? What would you hope to get out of it? What do you know about the racial wealth and income divide? So let's briefly talk about the scope of hunger before COVID-19. So before COVID-19, more than 35.2 million people in the US faced hunger, and over 34 million people were living below the federal poverty line. Half of American US households were just one paycheck away from losing so much. At the height of COVID-19, more than 40% of people living in the US are facing hunger. Hunger increased by 3 times due to COVID-19. Over 17% of people in the US were living below the poverty line, and likely more than half of American households lost so much because of losing their job. We want to look specifically at the Tampa Bay area. So in Tampa, nearly 1 in 3 African American households face hunger, compared to 1 in 14 white households, which is almost 5 times as much. African American households in Tampa are twice as likely to have 0 net worth compared to white households. Feeding Tampa Bay estimates that 600,000 people in the Bay Area were food insecure during the pandemic. And across the 10-county region, they served more than 1 million meals. By the end of the year, they are on track to serve over 85 million meals. 1 in 6 adults and 1 in 4 children are those people who have been on these food lines for the first time because of COVID-19. Before the pandemic, people of color were more likely to face all 3 of these things, and being twice as likely to experience them: hunger, living below the federal poverty line, and becoming 1 paycheck away from becoming poor. During the pandemic, Black, Latino, and Indigenous households have become 3 times as likely to experience these realities compared to their white counterparts. So when we think about wealth, we don't just think about the ability to take vacations or to live in a big house. We see wealth as the ability to insulate us, to protect us from a pandemic or from a natural disaster, or to afford our children a college education and perhaps maybe pay for a portion of it so they don't have so much college debt. If you don't have that ability to accumulate wealth over time and to pass it down from generation to generation, you're more likely to experience poverty and hunger. So these are the things that we'd like you to take away from tonight's experience. Really understand why racial equity is so important and why it should be addressed from structural inequality. A comfort level that maybe you didn't feel before, talking about the importance of racial equity within your organizations and the larger community. Most especially, we hope that you will incorporate what we like to call a racial equity lens in all of your work. So whether it's within the church, in your family, at your job, in your community, that you would see things differently, right? When you listen to the news and they talk about how COVID has impacted African American and Latino households more than other groups, you'll have a better understanding of why that is now. So pre-COVID-19, we would do the simulation in person. We would be seated at tables of 4 to 8 people, and we would have all of our material in front of us. We would have our race cards, we would have our action cards, which is money, land, and lost opportunity, and we would have our policy cards. We're going to be looking at 13 federal policies. We can't do this in person right now, so we've created this virtual way of doing it. So these are the instructions that I'm going to give you right now. If your name, your first name, begins with the letter A through M, I would like you to pretend that you are a Black person for this evening. And if you're already Black, you're still going to experience being Black in the simulation. If your name starts with an N through Z, I would ask you to be a white participant. And again, if you're already white, you will be a white participant in the simulation. Earlier today, I sent an email with an action card. You don't have to use it if you don't want to, but if you want to keep a tally of your action cards yourself, that's what that action card is for. But don't worry, we're going to keep it on the screen for you as well. So like I said, there are 13 policies that we're going to be reading. We've got 4 different co-facilitators who will be reading the policies tonight. At the end of each policy, you will take an action based on whether you are taking on the role of a white participant or a Black participant in the simulation. So again, if your name is from A through M, you are a Black participant. And if your name is from N to Z, you are a white participant. So with that, let us start with Carlos reading policy number 1.
Policy number 1, land seizures, 1865 to present day. Andrew Johnson's land policies and sharecropping. After the Civil War, only 30,000 African Americans owned small plots of land, compared to 4 million who did not, because an 1865 federal law rescinded the government's promise of 40 acres of land for former slaves. These 4 million Blacks largely resorted to renting the farmland of their previous master in exchange for a share of their crop. This system of sharecropping tied farmers to their former master because they were legally obligated to buy all farming materials, usually at higher prices, and sell their farming crops solely to their former master, usually at lower prices.
So this is the action. If you are a Black participant, you will add 1 land card and 1 money card to represent the less than 1% of African Americans who were able to own land and not face debt after slavery. Unfortunately, Black participants should also add 4 lost opportunity cards for the 4 million African Americans who had to sharecrop and were denied the initial promise of land ownership. Buying farm supplies from the landowner at higher prices only to sell their crops back at lower prices resulted in African Americans facing higher levels of debt and higher rates of hunger. So if you've ever watched a Spike Lee movie, his tagline is 40 acres and a mule. And this is where it comes from. from this piece of history. So right now, Black participants have 4 lost opportunity cards, 1 money card, and 1 land card.
Policy number 2, Andrew Johnson's Land Policies and Sharecropping from 1865 to 1880. Land seizures. From 1865 on, Blacks could have their land seized to pay sharecropping debts, or simply because white landowners declared the Black farmers or businesses were in debt. Blacks could not fight these charges because they were legally prohibited from suing whites in court. In addition, from 1949 to 1970, 1 million people lost their land to abuses of the power of eminent domain, which allows local governments to seize private property. About 70% of these families were African American.
If you are a white participant, you will add 1 land card and 2 money cards for having the legal ability to seize the land of Black farmers and business owners, increasing your income and reducing your vulnerability to hunger. If you are a Black participant, you will subtract a land card for the land lost under land seizures. You will also subtract a money card for the tens of millions of dollars lost from no longer having land to help earn an income and grow food to eat. So after policy number 10, you see that Black participants have lost the money in the land that they gained in policy 1, and white participants have gained 2 money cards and a land card.
Policy number 3, the National Housing Act of 1934, Part 1. The National Housing Act of 1934, Part 1. Policies under this law guaranteed federally backed loans to whites and legally refused loans to Blacks and anyone else who chose to live in or near Black neighborhoods. This practice, known as redlining, targeted entire Black neighborhoods and identified them as Grade D. This made it nearly impossible for appraisers in the private sector to do business in Black neighborhoods because all the residents were considered bad credit risks.
White participants will add 1 land card and 1 money card for the equity gained in purchasing homes not near Black neighborhoods. Equity increased a family's ability to save for future needs. Black participants do not add any land cards because of the inability to purchase homes. Do not add any money cards since it was illegal to lend to Blacks, preventing them from building equity and weakening their ability to save for future needs. So after policy number 3, we see that Black participants still have 4 lost opportunity cards, and white participants have gained additional land, 2 land and 3 money cards.
Okay, here we go. Policy number 4, the National Housing Act of 1934, Part 2. Since this legislation prevented Blacks from receiving federally backed home mortgages, whites usually purchased homes in Black neighborhoods and then sold housing contracts to Blacks who wanted to become homeowners, often for 2 or 3 times the amount of the mortgage. These contracts only guaranteed Black families the rights to the house after all the payments were complete. Missing even 1 payment or being late would result in the Black family losing their house immediately.
White participants will add 2 land cards for being able to legally purchase homes at the market rate and add 2 money cards for the equity earned from home ownership. Black participants will add 1 land card for signing a contract for a home in hopes of becoming a homeowner one day. Do not add any money cards because contracts stripped additional income and wealth from several generations. Also add one lost opportunity card because of the higher interest paid and less equity earned once the home was actually purchased. So we see that white participants have gained additional land and Black participants have gained additional lost opportunity as well as one land card. So again, taking a look at the Tampa Bay area. Tampa Bay, like the rest of the country, fell victim to these policies that the FHA put in place. The same neighborhoods that were redlined back during that time are the same neighborhoods that are experiencing either extreme poverty or extreme wealth. So if you look at this map, the area in green in the center is where most white families live. And the area in blue is the area where most Black families live. Unfortunately, those same blue areas have are concentrated areas of poverty, where poverty rates are as high as 20%. These same areas have people who are experiencing a higher exposure to lead, as well as being more likely to live in a community that has no grocery stores, known as a food desert or food apartheid. Again, looking at the Tampa Bay area at home ownership, 73.3% of the homes are owned by white families, while only 40.8% are owned by Black families. So we're going to stop here for a moment and we're going to take a 5-minute break. We just want to give you an opportunity to sort of decompress and just talk about how you're feeling based on the role. Okay, I see that everybody is back. We will have one more breakout at the end of the last policy, which will be longer, and an opportunity for you to dive a little deeper. I hope you all had some good discussions. So we will continue with policy number 5 with Scott.
All right, policy number 5, the Social Security Act of 1935. This act excluded farm workers and domestic workers who were predominantly Black from receiving old age and unemployment insurance. Although Social Security was meant to help those affected by the Great Depression, and African Americans were twice as likely as the average American family to face hunger during this time, 65% of African Americans were ineligible to receive Social Security.
If you are a white participant, you will add one money card for being able to benefit from unemployment and old age insurance during a very grim time in American history. If you are a Black participant, you will add one lost opportunity card for the inability to benefit from unemployment insurance, even though African Americans were between 2 and 3 times as likely as whites to experience hunger and poverty. So after this policy, we see that Black participants now have 6 lost opportunity cards and 1 land card, and white participants have 6 money cards and 4 land cards. So what you'll notice is that each is either losing opportunity or gaining wealth almost at the same time, same rate.
And policy number 6, the Fair Labor Standards Act of 1938. This was enacted to help bolster the economy and get the country out of the Great Depression, but it excluded tip-based jobs and other jobs predominantly held by Black workers, including servers, shoe shiners, domestic workers, and Pullman porters from this first ever minimum wage legislation. Even though the Black unemployment, hunger, and poverty rates were at least twice those of whites during the Great Depression, The very policies meant to alleviate economic strain were withheld from the Black community.
If you are a white participant, you will add one money card for benefiting from the minimum wage to make their families less susceptible to hunger and poverty. If you are a Black participant, you will add one lost opportunity card for being stuck in tip-based occupations that did not offer a minimum wage to help families survive during the Great Depression. This made it even harder for them to get back on their feet and build for the future. So after policy number 6, we see that Black participants have gained another lost opportunity card and white participants have gained another money card. So again, pausing to look at what this means for the Tampa Bay area today. And remember, this is pre-COVID, so these numbers are probably much higher. So in the Tampa Bay area, African Americans are about 3 times as likely to be unemployed, 5% versus almost 15%. African American workers largely are segregated in low-wage jobs, and the median income between white household and Black household is a difference of about $36,000. So 65,000 versus 29,000.
Policy number 7, the GI Bill of 1944. This was enacted to help World War II veterans adjust to civilian life by providing low-cost home mortgages, low-interest business loans, tuition assistance, and unemployment insurance. Unfortunately, Black veterans were excluded from many of these benefits.
If you are a white participant, you will add 2 money cards and 1 land card for the opportunities you receive, such as government guaranteed housing loans, which help build the American middle class. Black participants, if we were sitting in person at a table, only one person who is taking on the role of a Black participant would take a money card. Only one Black participant adds a money card representing the few African Americans who had access to some benefits of the GI Bill. All Black participants add 1 lost opportunity card for not being able to benefit from the GI Bill, even though they too had fought for the United States in World War II. So after policy number 7, white participants have gained additional money and land, and Black participants have gained another lost opportunity card, and only one person has gained a money card.
Policy number 8, overturn of the separation but equal doctrine, 1954 to present day. Policy number 8, the overturn of separate but equal doctrine. Although the separate but equal doctrine was declared unconstitutional in 1954, Brown versus Board of Ed, American schools are more racially segregated today than any other time in the past 4 decades. Academic success is less likely in predominantly low-income Black neighborhoods. Black students are 5 times as likely to live in an area concentrated poverty with underfunded, overstaffed, and overcrowded schools. This leaves Black students with limited education, and many often settle for minimum wage jobs that offer little hope of advancement or better pay.
If you are a white participant, you will add 2 money cards for having up to $733 higher annual per student spending on education than Black students. This contributes to a greater likelihood of attending college and later getting a higher paying job. Black participants, add only 1 money card to represent the 75% high school graduation rate among African American students, compared to 88% among white students. Also add 1 lost opportunity card for the lower student spending that helps funnel many Black students into low-wage work after high school. So after this policy, we see that white participants have gained additional land and money, and Black participants have gained one lost opportunity card and one money card. So again, taking a look at Florida now as a state, Black students typically attend schools with large majorities of fellow students living in poverty, while white Floridians on average attend majority middle-class schools. So if you are a white student, you are most likely attending a school that is almost 75% white. If you are African American, almost 50% African American. And if you are Latino, almost 60% Latino. Now, remember, we talked about equity, right? Equity means changing policies or programs, putting a little extra here and there to create an equitable outcome. So when we look at the CARES Act, which was passed last year, I believe it was the first bill passed during COVID, there was $301 billion that went specifically to schools, but half of those dollars went to charter and private schools. So those very schools in those very neighborhoods where they really could have benefited from it, they didn't get the money.
Policy number 9, subprime loans from 1970 to present day. Starting in the 1970s and continuing today, the private sector issued subprime loans, loans with higher interest rates to Black families, almost exclusively, regardless of a family's income, education, or good credit history. As a result, Blacks continue to unfairly pay more for homes of the same value as their white counterparts. This increases foreclosure rates among Blacks, which also contributes to high food insecurity levels.
If you are a white participant, you will add 2 land cards and 2 money cards for securing good interest rates on homes. If you are a Black participant, Blacks were forced into subprime mortgages as their only option for more than 3 generations, stripping income and wealth from the Black community. High-income Blacks were 80% more likely to lose their homes than high-income whites when the housing bubble burst in 2008, and 240,000 Blacks lost their homes. Therefore, Black participants will add only 1 land card and 1 money card. I was one of those 240,000 people who lost my home during this time. I moved from Virginia to Florida to take care of my dad, and I put my house up for sale in Virginia, and I moved here without a job. And I wasn't concerned because I lived in a great neighborhood with great schools. It was a beautiful home. I was 30 minutes from DC, and I had never had a hard time finding a job before. But 6 months later, I would lose my home to foreclosure because I couldn't make the mortgage payments and my rent here without a job. So I went through all of my 401k and all of my savings, and still ended up losing my home, obviously. It would take me 10 years to become a homeowner again. But I know that my story is not the norm, right? There are a lot of barriers that folks face that I've not had to face in my life because I do have an education. I do come from a strong middle-class family. My family was able to build wealth, so they were able to assist me to get back on my feet again. But again, I know that my story is not the norm. So after this policy, we see that white participants have gained 2 land cards and a money card, 2 money cards, I'm sorry. Black participants have gained 1 money card and 1 land card.
Policy number 10, the war on drugs, 1971 to present day. The war on drugs, initiated in 1971 and continuing today, widened the racial wealth gap with policies targeting Black and brown communities. Although rates of using and selling drugs are comparable across racial lines, Blacks are up to 10 times as likely to be stopped, searched, arrested, prosecuted, convicted, and or incarcerated for drug violations as whites. Since this means that Black families are up to 10 times as likely to have a family member sent to prison, they are more than 10 times as likely to fall into hunger because of incarceration.
White participants will subtract 2 money cards for the more than $180 billion in tax dollars that it costs to maintain mass incarceration today. Also, add 1 lost opportunity card, since these taxpayer dollars could instead be used to support programs that end hunger and poverty in the United States. Black participants' combined debt and property depreciation increase hunger and poverty rates within the Black community. Subtract 2 money cards for being more likely to be incarcerated than whites and owing debts of about $13,000 per household in fees and court costs when a family member is incarcerated. Subtract 1 land card for the estimated $11 billion in lower property values in many African American communities caused by the return of large numbers of people from jail or prison. So I want to pause here for a second and point out a couple of things to you. This is the first policy where if you are a white participant, you actually lose money and gain lost opportunity. But it is at the expense of your fellow Black participant. So in this war on drugs and maintaining mass incarceration, nobody benefits from this. This hurts everybody. Specifically in Tampa Bay last week, I don't know if anyone on this call attended, but I guess it was Metropolitan Ministries that hosted a conversation just about this, about the fines and fees and court costs that go with being incarcerated and having your driver's license suspended. All of these collateral consequences that prevent someone for a minor drug infraction from moving on with their life and just trying to do better. So after this policy, we see that white participants have lost money as well as Black participants, and Black participants have also lost land, and white participants have gained an opportunity loss card.
Policy number 11, life after incarceration, consequences of the war on drugs, present day. When people are released from jail or prison, they are hoping for a second chance, but they face more than 48,000 separate restrictions known as collateral consequences. Some examples of lifelong penalties include being denied the right to vote in some states, being prohibited from applying to higher paying jobs, being ineligible to participate in social safety net programs such as SNAP, the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, formerly food stamps, and other restrictions such as being banned from getting a barber's license. Since Blacks are up to 10 times as likely as whites to be stopped, arrested, and sentenced, they are also up to 10 times as likely to face these restrictions.
Black participants, there are 5 times as many Blacks as whites returning home with criminal records. Add 2 lost opportunity cards to represent how Black communities are more likely to fall into hunger because so many returnees are unable to reintegrate into society, get a job, and or access SNAP benefits. So after this policy, we see that Black participants have gained 2 more lost opportunity cards. So again, taking a look at the Tampa Bay area, African Americans are 3.6 times more likely to be arrested and jailed as whites for the possession of marijuana. This is part of the over-policing and mass incarceration issue that we just talked about in policies 10 and 11. And again, thinking about what equity could be in present day legislation, again in the CARES Act, there was money for the Paycheck Protection Program for those who were self-employed. But if you were an ex-felon who had not been out for at least 5 years and were a business owner, you did not qualify for the Paycheck Protection Program.
Policy number 12, employment discrimination, present day. Although racial discrimination in the workforce was legally abolished in 1964 with the Civil Rights Act, racial discrimination continues among all educational levels and job sectors. For example, Blacks are twice as likely not to be called back after they complete job applications or interviews. In addition, the gap between the hourly pay of Blacks and whites has grown from $3.55 an hour in 1979 to $6.73 an hour in 2016.
White participants will add too many cards for being twice as likely to receive a call back for a job and for earning an average of $14,000 a year more than your Black peers. Black participants will add 2 lost opportunity cards for being 2 times less likely to receive a job call back and for earning an average of $14,000 a year less than your white peers. Doing the math shows that racial discrimination in the workforce costs Black workers at least $600,000 over the course of their working years. After policy number 12, white participants have gained 2 more money cards. Black participants have gained 2 lost opportunity cards.
Policy number 13, the voting restrictions, 1890 to present day. Voting is key to ending hunger. As early as 1890, Blacks faced organized campaigns to prevent them from voting, including biased literacy tests, poll taxes, and lynching. In 1965, the Voting Rights Act passed, making efforts to prevent voting illegal. Today, people returning from jail or prison who are disproportionately Black are denied the right to vote in many states. In addition, as recently as 2017, states have proposed voter ID laws, which would require voters to have government-issued identification. It is more difficult for African Americans to obtain these. 1 in 4 face barriers compared with 1 in 10 whites. Barriers include, for example, having to pay up to $150 for an acceptable copy of a birth certificate and Social Security card, travel costs, and time taken off from work.
Black participants will add 1 lost opportunity card for 1 being prevented from voting in the early 1900s when the votes of Black people might have prevented some of the harmful laws mentioned in the assimilation from being enacted, and 2, still facing voting restrictions that disproportionately impact Black communities and weaken efforts to improve policies that end hunger and poverty. So I want to pause here for a second again. I'm sure that you all noticed some things. We voted to reinstore voting rights for ex-felons about 2 years ago. And then the state of Florida, basically what they did was they put a literacy, a poll tax on that segment of the population to make it harder for them to vote. So FRRC, the group that got that bill to pass, raised money now so that they can pay these fees and fines so that folks can continue to gain their right to vote. The other thing that just passed, and I think it's in 43 states that are looking at new voting laws that change the requirement for when you request and receive your mail-in ballot. Again, it makes it difficult for some people to be able to vote. I think of the elderly who maybe are not very mobile, and they've just made it more difficult for that group of people. So after this last policy, Black participants have gained 1 lost opportunity card. So what you're looking at on your screen now is a timeline of all of the policies that we just looked at together from 1865 to today, beginning with the abolition of slavery, followed by the distribution of land, followed by seizures of that land, followed by the National Housing Act. And in my opinion, of all of the policies that did the most damage, redlining was probably the harshest one because it divided communities. It literally created segregated neighborhoods. And then on top of that, it impacted our educational system. That was followed with the Social Security Act of 1935, and it would take 30 years for the Social Security Act to be amended so that everyone would qualify for it. So it was 1965 before everyone qualified for the Social Security Act. That was then followed with subprime loans from 1970 to today, followed with separate but equal in 1954 to today. And like we said, schools are more segregated than they've ever been. And then with the GI Bill in 1944, if we had the chance to get things right before, we surely got it wrong in 1954 with the GI Bill, because this is where the middle class was born. So everybody could have had an opportunity to be a homeowner, to go to college, because the government was funding all of this to rebuild the economy. But again, it was a missed opportunity. Followed with the Fair Labor Standards Act of 1938. And we all know we're still fighting for a minimum wage, let alone a living wage. Then with the war on drugs in 1971 to today. I think that after the redlining policies, that the war on drugs probably had the most damage, because that obviously feeds into our mass incarceration system, which has become a money-making industry. And then, of course, the collateral consequences of life after incarceration that continues on to today, with employment discrimination and voting restrictions. So now let's see how many money cards everyone ended up with. If you are a Black participant, you had only one participant had one money card. You have 2 land cards, and you have 14 lost opportunity cards. If you are a white participant, you have 13 money cards, 7 land cards, and 1 lost opportunity card. So when we're looking at a median net worth household, that ratio in real life is 13 to 1. So in real US dollars, the wealth gap between Black and white households is 13 to 1. And we don't mean that this is the case for every white household or every Black household. We are saying in a typical median net worth household. Now, some people ask, what about people who are living near the poverty line? We know that there are white people who are poor as well. And in that scenario, in real life dollars, the gap is even wider. For every $18,000 a white household has, a Black household has 0. So I want to just share some information with you about reparations, because I know that that's probably one of the conversations that you're going to have in this next breakout. What do reparations look like? Before I started to dig up for some more current information, I used to always share with people that for me, reparations means addressing the things that were done in those redline communities, offering people mortgage-free loans or home improvement loans at no interest rate, or a business loan without any interest rate for those people who have a social entrepreneurial spirit, or investing in the schools that have become so inferior, with the best Wi-Fi and paying teachers a living wage, so you've got the best teachers. So that is actually going on in some cities, not at the federal level, obviously. So at the federal level, for 3 decades, Representative John Conyers, who died about 2 years ago, introduced House Resolution 40. It was a commission to study and develop reparation proposals for African Americans Act. For 3 decades, every session, he would introduce this and it would go nowhere. This year was the first year that it actually made it into the Judiciary Committee and it actually passed. So this is a really, really huge thing that they've approved this study to look at what the impact of slavery has been on African Americans and what reparations could look like. So an example of a local entity doing something in March in Evanston, Illinois, they became one of the first US cities to offer Black residents reparations. It was a vote of 8-1. So this is the start of the program, and they hope that this is something that will continuously get funded so they can help more people. They are giving household loans to 16 families, $25 each for home repairs on their property. Again, in these red line communities that we've been talking about. And it's going to be funded by legalized marijuana. In the city council in Asheville, North Carolina, they voted unanimously last July in favor of reparations for Black residents that would take the form of helping businesses and providing housing and healthcare. Other local governments in all of those other states are looking at similar opportunities. In Oregon, the state senator Lou Frederick said local and state efforts, if they gain more traction, can help build support eventually for reparations on the federal level. And Oregon wasn't even a slave state, but its constitution did bar Black settlers, a provision that wasn't repealed until 1927. And then last, there is a young woman. Her last name is Hicks Gilbert. Her first name is, she's from Elaine, Arkansas. She's a descendant of survivors of the 1919 Elaine massacre. It was one of many episodes throughout the country where entire communities were just destroyed. When Black sharecroppers in that town joined together to negotiate for fairer terms and wages, they were attacked by white mobs. More than 200 Black men, women, and children were killed. She doesn't believe that federal reparations will happen in her lifetime, but through her work as an advocate for descendants of the massacre, she is pushing for legislation that would have the state officially recognize those killings and set up educational opportunities. Thank you to everyone for sharing. I'm just going to put my PowerPoint back on the screen. And I have this wonderful video that we don't have time to show, but I'm going to share this PowerPoint and the recording with everyone. So you will be able to watch it. It's called Race is Made Up. It's a great way to end what you've just experienced and gives you this reminder that, as Ibram Kendi said, race is a mirage. Race was created to benefit a small group of wealthy people who wanted to hold on to that wealth, and what race has really done to us, to the fabric of this country. Locally, if you wanted to get involved in some efforts, there is FAST. If you haven't heard of FAST, the link will be on the PowerPoint, as well as DART in Hillsborough County. You can stay connected with me at ffriendshipbread.org. You can get involved in our Offering of Letters campaign. We have a brand new website just for our Offering of Letters. You can bring this assimilation to other groups. Many people have already talked about that, so I look forward to hearing from you. And then if you go to bread.org/racial equity, there are lots more tools around this sort of information. So I thank you for everybody being here. I thank you to the co-facilitators. I know that this is a hard journey, but this is a great group because you guys talked a lot about solutions. So I know you're going to do big things in your area.